Interesting. So, which is, the subsequent question and the follow-up question that I really had was, how does preservation act as a catalyst for creation?
Well, in a sense, like it's a big part of the deal because they're motivated by preservation. Like if you
Mm,
actually read a lot of the reasons for doing this stuff, preservation features a lot more than you'd think. And then
mm,
almost as a byproduct, creation becomes one of the things that ends up happening. That there's so, I think science probably ends up uh, advancing at a pace that Bacon would not quite have realized was possible, right?
mm, mm. So therefore, can you explain it with an example of how preservation acts as a catalyst for creation?
Well,
And
if you think,
yeah,
yeah,
and in fact, you go out and explain that in how the old English buildings where when they went out and started preserving that in your book, right? You talk about how they started ensuring that the old buildings are preserved so that there is some kind of a history that people can have as the buildings facade started changing, right? At the start of the industrialized era. So again, going back to preservation as a catalyst for creation, because that's something that you normally don't associate with, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, in the sense of, so what you're referring to there in my book is in the early 20th century, I'll just summarize it for listeners. In the early 20th century, there's a movement to, well, so much is being created by the Victorians, that a lot of the older buildings are being torn down, right? Um, the Victorians really didn't care that much about the history a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes they did, but in terms of just the general sense of this is a nice old building from the Middle Ages, they'll be like, can we build something better? Tear it down, build a new thing. They don't worry that much about the historical associations. And so you do get these movements in the late 19th century about let's hold on a second and try to work out what's actually valuable and what's not. Um, and a great deal of work is done in the 1920s, 30s, and even to an extent over the 40s. But obviously, with the war, with the Second World War, there's a kind of puts a pause to a lot of these things to try and preserve ancient buildings. The Society of Arts was behind trying to preserve ancient cottages. That is, normal dwellings that would not have been the sorts of things that would be considered official monuments, like the earliest stuff to be preserved is stuff like Stonehenge, really ancient monuments where they suddenly think, well, actually, maybe this stuff ought not to just be chipped away by every tourist. We should try to work out, if we preserve these things, we might actually discover more about them. Actually, a great example of this today, of how the concern with preservation can end up being so useful, is some of your listeners may or may not be aware, there's a big prize right now to read scrolls that were dug up in the 18th century from the volcanic blast at Vesuvius. So I think it's the 1720s. A shepherd discovers, walking around Herculaneum, near Pompeii, the famous Pompeii, that he discovers basically a bunch of scrolls. They try to open them very carefully in the 18th century, but I think the first 2 or 3 scrolls, they just crumble to dust. They're just way too fragile. And so after that, they just preserved all of them. They tried not to touch them at all. And only now, with advances in AI, with advances in particle physics, with advances in all of the technology associated with those things, those can be read, right? So they can digitally unfurl the scrolls without actually having to. They can scan the thing without actually having to break them open. So the preservation there will end up presumably giving us quite a lot of detail once we can read what's inside them, which may be done by the end of the year if the prize is won. There's quite a lot of money up for grabs if any of your listeners are interested. I think by 31st of December. So you're almost we're almost there. There's quite a lot of information up for grabs. And it's interesting that, it's that I think is part of that kind of feedback mechanism, is that sometimes preserving stuff can end up giving us quite a lot more information down the line, which could be of interest. I mean, if it turns out that some of that stuff is lost scrolls from, telling us about ancient science and technology. That could be huge, right? There could be
Yeah.
vast swathes of things where, I mean, it's amazing the extent to which our knowledge of what happened in the past is basically defined by whether or not one or two books survived or were copied out, or pieces of work managed to kind of withstand the test of time. Even what we have today from what I researched at the time, 16th, 17th century material, there will have been hundreds of copies of books printed, and yet we only have one or two surviving, and it's based on those one or two, of each book run. It's based on those ones and twos that we actually know anything at all sometimes about what was in the contents of those books, or based on the contents of those books, what was going on. And that's the big thing about printing, right? That makes such a big difference. Manuscripts, they're so laborious to copy out. Printing is, again, overwhelmingly seen as a preservation technology. You create 100 copies instead of just one copy. That means maybe one of them will in a few hundred years survive, and our knowledge won't just disappear.
Amazing, amazing.